The Bluebonnet Diner sat at the corner of Main and Cypress in Harlingen, Texas, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the gossip was always fresh. It had been there for 40 years, surviving floods and recessions and the slow drain of small-town life, held together by checkered linoleum, red vinyl booths, and a cook named Benny, who'd never missed a shift since 1987. The regulars knew each other by name, by order, by the particular way they took their eggs. Strangers stood out. Yeah, Victor Rojas was a stranger. He sat in the back booth, the one nearest the emergency exit, with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door. It was habit, the kind you pick up after 20 years of living in places where sitting with your back exposed could get you killed. He was 53 years old, with a gray-streaked beard, a leather vest covered in patches from the Hijos del Camino motorcycle club, and hands that had done things he didn't talk about anymore. He'd been riding south from San Antonio, no destination in mind, just the road and the wind and the silence that came with both. The coffee was decent, the eggs were better. Victor ate slowly, watching the morning unfold through the grease-spotted window. A mother pushing a stroller. An old man walking a dog too small for his leash. 2 teenage boys on bikes circling the parking lot like sharks who hadn't found their prey yet. He noticed the boys because noticing was what kept you alive. They were maybe 15, 16, old enough to drive but young enough to still think cruelty was courage. One was tall and angular, with a face that hadn't grown into its bones. The other was stocky, built like a wrestler, with a smirk that suggested he'd never faced consequences for anything in his life. They circled twice, then parked their bikes near the diner's side entrance and leaned against the wall, waiting. Victor went back to his eggs. Not his business, not his town. He'd learned a long time ago that getting involved in other people's problems was a good way to make them your own. The bell above the door chimed and a boy walked in. He was small, maybe 8 or 9, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He wore a backpack that was too big for him and a t-shirt with a faded superhero logo that Victor didn't recognize. He moved with the careful precision of a kid who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, shoulders hunched, eyes down, footsteps quiet. The boy walked to the counter and climbed onto a stool. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Darlene, according to her name tag, smiled at him with the easy warmth of someone who'd seen him before. "Hey, Lucas, the usual?" "Yes, ma'am. Chocolate milk and a blueberry muffin, please." "Coming right up, sweetheart." Lucas pulled a book from his backpack and set it on the counter. It was thick, with a spaceship on the cover and a title Victor couldn't read from across. The Room. The boy opened it to a dog-eared page and began to read, his lips moving slightly with the words, completely absorbed. Victor watched him for a moment, then looked back out the window. The 2 teenagers were still there, but they'd moved closer to the door. They were watching the diner now, watching with the kind of focused attention that made Victor's instincts prickle. He told himself it was nothing. Kids loitered. Kids watched. It didn't mean anything. He finished his eggs, pushed the plate aside, and signaled Darlene for more coffee. She brought the pot over, refilled his cup, and lingered for a moment. "Passing through?" she asked. "Something like that." "Heading anywhere particular?" "Not especially." She nodded, the way people in small towns nod when they recognize someone who doesn't want to talk. "Well, let me know if you need anything else." "I will." She moved back to the counter, and Victor wrapped his hands around the warm cup and let his eyes drift back to the window. The teenagers had disappeared. He scanned the parking lot, the sidewalk, the street beyond. Nothing. They'd probably gotten bored and moved on. Then the side door opened and they walked in. They moved with purpose, not the aimless shuffle of kids killing time, but the directed energy of predators who'd spotted weakness. The tall one went to the counter first, sliding onto the stool next to Lucas with exaggerated casualness. The stocky one flanked the other side, blocking any easy exit. "Hey, Lucas," the tall one said. His voice was loud enough to carry, pitched for an audience. "Reading again? Don't you ever get tired of being such a little nerd?" Lucas didn't look up from his book. "Leave me alone, Derek." "Leave me alone, Derek," the stocky one mimicked in a high-pitched whine. "God, you're such a baby. Does your mommy know you're here all by yourself?" Victor's hands tightened round his coffee cup. He watched the scene unfold, cataloging details, the way Lucas's shoulders had gone rigid, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the page but weren't moving anymore, the way Darlene had frozen behind the counter, caught between intervention and the fear of making things worse. "I heard your dad left," Derek said, leaning closer. That true? You finally figure out what a loser you are and take off? Something flickered across Lucas's face. Pain, quick and sharp, before he buried it. Shut up. Ooh, tough guy. Derek reached over and knocked the book off the counter. It hit the floor with a slap that echoed through the quiet diner. What are you going to do about it, Lucas? Cry. Go ahead. Cry for your daddy. Oh, wait, he's not coming back, is he? The stocky one laughed, a harsh bark that bounced off the walls. A few other customers glanced over, then looked away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick, complicit, the kind of silence that let cruelty grow because confronting it was uncomfortable. Victor set down his coffee cup. He thought about all the reasons to stay in his booth. He was a stranger here. He didn't know the history, the context, the web of relationships that connected these kids to each other and to the town. Getting involved could make things worse. It could draw attention he didn't want. It could complicate a life he'd spent years trying to simplify. He thought about his own son, dead now for 15 years, killed in a roadside accident before he'd had the chance to grow into the man he might have been. He thought about all the times he wished someone had been there to protect him, to stand between him and a world that didn't care whether he survived it. He thought about the look on Lucas's face when Derek mentioned his father. Victor stood up. The booth creaked as he rose, and the sound was enough to draw attention. Derek and his friend turned, their smirks faltering, as they took in the man walking toward them. 6 feet tall, 220 pounds, arms covered in tattoos that told stories they couldn't read, eyes that had seen things that would give them nightmares. Victor stopped 3 feet away. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, arms folded, looking at the two teenagers with an expression that wasn't angry, wasn't threatening, but somehow managed to be both. We were just talking, Derek said. His voice had lost its swagger. Victor still didn't speak. He reached down, picked up Lucas's book, and set it gently on the counter. Then he looked at Derek, and something in that look made the boy take a step back. I think, Victor said slowly, his voice low and even, you're done talking. The diner was silent. Everyone was watching now. Darlene behind the counter, the old couple in the corner booth, the trucker by the window. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Derek's friend grabbed his arm. Come on, man, let's go. For a moment, Derek looked like he might argue. Then he looked at Victor again, and whatever he saw there changed his mind. He turned and walked toward the door, his friend close behind. The bell chimed as they left, and the tension in the room released like a held breath. Victor looked down at Lucas. The boy was staring up at him, his glasses slightly crooked, his eyes wide behind the lenses. You okay? Victor asked. Lucas nodded slowly. Yeah, I think so. Good. Victor picked up his coffee cup from the booth, walked to the counter, and set it down beside Lucas's book. He pulled a 20 from his wallet and laid it next to the cup. Keep the change, he told Darlene. Then he walked toward the door, his boots heavy on the linoleum, the patches on his vest catching the morning light. Mister? Victor stopped. He turned. Lucas was still sitting on the stool, but something in his posture had changed. He looked less like a boy trying to disappear and more like a boy trying to find the courage to speak. Thank you, Lucas said. Victor nodded once. Then he pushed through the door and walked out into the Texas morning, where his motorcycle waited and the road stretched south toward the border and beyond. He didn't know that Lucas would remember this moment for the rest of his life. He didn't know that Darlene would tell the story to everyone who came into the diner for the next month. He didn't know that sometimes standing up was just the beginning. All he knew was that his coffee was paid for, his tank was full, and somewhere down the road there was a quiet place where he could stop thinking about the son he'd lost and the boy he'd just met. He kicked the bike to life and pulled out of the parking lot, the engine's roar swallowing the silence behind him. Victor made it 12 miles south before he pulled off the highway and stopped at a rest area overlooking the Rio Grande. The river was low this time of year, more brown than blue, cutting through the scrubland like a scar that had never quite healed. He killed the engine and sat there for a long time, watching the water move and trying to figure out why he couldn't stop thinking about a boy in a diner. It wasn't his problem. He'd done what needed doing, and now it was over. The kid was fine. The bullies were gone. End of story. Except it wasn't. Victor had been riding long enough to know when something had hooked into him, and this had hooked deep. The look on Lucas's face when Derek mentioned his father, the way the boy's shoulders had curved inward, like he was trying to protect something that had already been broken. Victor recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself, Once, a long time ago. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. He had numbers in there he hadn't called in years, old friends, old enemies, people from a life he'd tried to leave behind. He scrolled past them until he found the one he was looking for. Elena answered on the third ring. "Victor, is that you?" "It's me." "Dios mio, I thought you were dead." "Not yet." He almost smiled. "How are you, Elena?" "Old, tired, running the same restaurant, serving the same customers, wondering why I never moved to Florida like I said I would." Her voice was warm despite the words, the voice of someone who complained because it was easier than admitting she was content. "Where are you?" "Harlingen, or just south of it." "Harlingen? What are you doing down there?" "Passing through." He paused. "I need a favor." Elena was quiet for a moment. They'd known each other for 30 years, since before Victor had joined the club, before his son was born, before everything that came after. She'd been a friend of his wife's first, then his friend after the divorce, then something harder to define after his son died, and he'd disappeared into the road for the better part of a decade. She was the only person from his old life who still answered when he called. "What kind of favor?" she asked. "I need to know about a family. A boy named Lucas, maybe 8 or 9, lives here in Harlingen, or close to it. His father left recently. That's all I know." "Victor." Her voice shifted. "Careful now. Why do you need to know this?" He told her about the diner, the Bullies, the way Lucas had sat there and taken it, his eyes fixed on a page he wasn't reading, his hands gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He told her about the book on the floor, and the silence that had let it happen, and the look on the boy's face when Victor had stood up. "He reminded me of Miguel," Victor said. The name still hurt to say, even after 15 years. The way he was trying so hard to be invisible, like if he just made himself small enough, the world would stop hurting him. Elena was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I'll ask around. Harlingen's not that big. Someone will know something." "Thank you." "Victor." She hesitated. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, be careful. You can't save everyone." "I know. Do you?" He didn't answer. He just said goodbye and hung up, and sat there watching the river until the sun climbed high enough to burn the back of his neck. Elena called back the next morning. Victor was in a motel room on the edge of town, the kind of place that charged by the night and didn't ask questions. He'd slept poorly, his dreams full of faces he tried not to remember, and he was on his second cup of bad coffee when the phone rang. "His name is Lucas Medina," Elena said. 8 years old. Lives with his mother Sandra in a duplex on Elm Street. Father's name is Carlos. He left about 6 months ago. Gambling debts, from what I hear. Took off in the middle of the night and hasn't been seen since. Victor wrote the address on the back of a receipt. "What about the mother?" "Works 2 jobs. Waitress at a Mexican place called La Paloma during the day. Cleans offices at night. She's barely keeping the lights on." Elena paused. "The boy walks to school by himself. Walks home by himself, too. Half the neighborhood knows those kids have been picking on him, but nobody does anything. His mother filed a complaint with the school last month. Nothing came of it." "What about the Bullies? Derek and the other one?" "Derek Shawcross. His father owns the car dealership on the highway, biggest employer in town after the hospital. The other kid is his cousin, Ryan. They've been causing trouble for years, but Daddy's money keeps them out of any real consequences." Her voice hardened. "You know how it works, Victor. Some kids are untouchable." Victor knew. He'd grown up in a town like this one, where the right last name could excuse almost anything, and the wrong one could condemn you before you'd done anything at all. He'd watched boys like Derek grow into men like Derek, their cruelty calcifying into something colder and more dangerous as the years went on. And he'd watched boys like Lucas disappear into silence, into anger, into the kind of despair that didn't always end well. "Anything else?" he asked. "Just one thing." Elena's tone shifted again, cautious. "The mother, Sandra, she's proud. The kind of proud that comes from having nothing and refusing to let anyone see it. She's not going to accept help easily, Victor. Not from a stranger, and definitely not from someone who looks like you." "I'm not trying to help." "Then what are you trying to do?" Victor looked at the address on the receipt. Elm Street. He could picture it without having been there, a quiet block of small houses and duplexes, chain-link fences and patchy lawns, the kind of place where people worked hard and still fell behind. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'll figure it out." He found the duplex that afternoon. It was exactly what he'd imagined. A squat building with faded yellow siding and a porch that sagged in the middle. A bicycle leaned against the steps, too small to belong to anyone but a child. The yard was neat despite its smallness, with a flower bed along the front that someone had tried to maintain. Victor parked across the street and waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for exactly. A sign, maybe. A reason to stay or a reason to go. He'd spent so many years running from things that he'd forgotten how to move toward them. At 3:15, a school bus stopped at the corner and Lucas climbed off. He was wearing the same backpack as before, the same too big look, but today there was something different about the way he moved. His head was up, his shoulders weren't quite so hunched. He walked down the sidewalk with purpose, and when he reached the duplex, he stopped. He'd seen Victor's motorcycle. The boy stood frozen for a moment, his eyes moving from the bike to the man sitting on it. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something harder to read. Surprise, maybe, or hope, or the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust good things when they appeared. Victor raised a hand. A simple gesture, nothing threatening. Lucas raised his hand back, then he turned and walked up the steps and disappeared inside, and Victor was alone again with the quiet street and the question of what he was supposed to do next. He stayed until dark. He watched lights come on in the duplex, watched shadows move behind the curtains, watched a woman arrive home in a car that sounded like it needed a new muffler. Sandra Medina, he assumed. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the kind of tired that went deeper than sleep could fix. She didn't notice him. She went inside, and the door closed, and Victor sat in the growing darkness and thought about a boy who'd waved back at a stranger. He thought about his son, who would have been 32 this year. He thought about all the things he'd never gotten to teach him, all the conversations they'd never had, all the years that had been stolen by a drunk driver on a stretch of highway outside Austin. He thought about Lucas and the bullies and the silence that had let it happen, and he made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in almost 3 years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Rojas. I need to talk to the chapter president. Tell him it's about a kid in Harlingen who needs some friends." The chapter president of Hijos del Camino was a man named Aurelio Garza, though everyone called him Lobo. He'd earned the name 30 years ago, in circumstances no one talked about anymore, and he'd spent the decades since building a club that was equal parts brotherhood and redemption. The Hijos weren't angels. They'd done things that wouldn't survive scrutiny, but they'd also built a reputation for protecting the people the world forgot to protect. Women fleeing violence, kids aging out of foster care, families caught in the crossfire of problems too big to solve alone. Victor had ridden with them for 15 years before his son died. After that, he drifted away, unable to be around the brotherhood without thinking about everything he'd lost. Lobo had let him go without judgment, the way you let go of a man who needs to grieve in his own way, and he'd left the door open for when Victor was ready to come back. 3 years of silence. And now, this. "Tell me about the boy," Lobo said. They were sitting in the back room of a bar in McAllen, 50 miles west of Harlingen. The room smelled like old cigarettes and cheap beer, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging above a pool table no one used anymore. Lobo was 64 years old, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interrupting as Victor told him everything: the diner, the bullies, the look on Lucas's face, the duplex on Elm Street. When Victor finished, Lobo was quiet for a long moment. He turned a bottle of beer in his hands, watching the light catch the glass. "You know this isn't club business," he said finally. "I know. We don't ride into towns and solve people's problems. That's not what we do." "I know that too." Lobo looked at him. "But you're asking anyway." Victor met his eyes. "I'm asking for help. Not for the club. For me. And for this kid who doesn't have anyone else. He has a mother. His mother works 18 hours a day and can barely keep the lights on. She filed a complaint with the school and nothing happened. The bully's father owns half the town." Victor leaned forward. "You know how this goes, Lobo. You've seen it. The kid gets ground down day after day, and either he breaks or he hardens into something that breaks other people. I'm not asking you to fix his life. I'm asking you to show him that someone gives a damn." Lobo set down the beer. He folded his hands on the table and studied Victor with the same unreadable expression he'd worn for 30 years. "Miguel would have been 32 this year," he said quietly. The name hit Victor like a fist. He hadn't expected Lobo to say it. No one said it anymore. It had become a silence everyone agreed to keep. "I know," Victor said. His voice was rough. "You couldn't save him. That wasn't your fault." "I know that too." He didn't. Not really. He'd spent 15 years trying to believe it and failing every time, but he said it anyway, because saying it was easier than explaining the truth. Lobo nodded slowly. "You're not trying to save Miguel. You understand that, right? This boy, Lucas, he's not your son. He's not a replacement. He's just a kid who got unlucky." "I know." "Do you?" Victor didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain the thing that had hooked into him at the diner, the recognition that went deeper than logic. He just knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not this time. Lobo was silent for another long moment. Then he sighed, a sound that carried the weight of decades. "What do you need?" "Bodies, not to fight, just to show up. Enough leather and chrome to make a point." Victor paused. "The boy's being harassed because no one's standing behind him. I want to change that." "Standing behind him how?" "I don't have a plan yet, but I'm thinking about visibility, showing up at places where people can see us, making it clear that he's not alone." Lobo raised an eyebrow. "You want to intimidate a couple of teenage bullies with a motorcycle club? I want to show a kid that the world has people in it who will stand up for him. If that intimidates the bullies, that's a bonus." Something shifted in Lobo's face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "You always were a soft touch, Rojas, underneath all that." He stood up, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "I'll make some calls. The McAllen chapter can spare some guys, and I know a few from Brownsville who've been looking for an excuse to ride. Give me 48 hours. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Lobo pulled on his jacket, the leather creaking with age. "You still have to talk to the mother. She might not want our help. She might not want you anywhere near her son." "I know." "And if she says no?" Victor thought about Lucas waving from the sidewalk, the small gesture of trust from a boy who had no reason to trust anyone. "Then I'll respect that," he said, "but I have to try." Lobo nodded. He walked to the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "It's good to see you, Victor, even under these circumstances." He glanced back over his shoulder. "The road's been missing you. So have we." Then he was gone, and Victor was alone with the single bulb and the empty pool table and the weight of everything he'd set in motion. The next morning, Victor went to La Paloma. The restaurant was a small place on a side street, the kind of family-owned spot that survived on regulars and word of mouth. The walls were painted in faded murals of desert landscapes and Mexican villages, and the air smelled like cumin and roasted peppers. A bell chimed when Victor walked in, and a few heads turned to look at him before turning back to their plates. Sandra Medina was behind the counter, refilling a coffee pot. She was wearing a blue apron over a plain white blouse, her dark hair pulled back the same way it had been the night before. She looked up when he approached, and her expression shifted from customer service pleasant to something warier. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Medina?" The wariness deepened. "Who's asking?" "My name is Victor Rojas. I was at the Bluebonnet Diner a few days ago, when your son was being bothered by some boys. I wanted to talk to you about that, if you have a minute." Sandra's face went through several changes in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, recognition, and finally a guarded suspicion that settled over her features like a mask. "You're the one who stood up," she said. "Lucas told me about you." "Yes, ma'am. He also told me you've been parked outside our house." Victor didn't flinch. "I wasn't trying to frighten anyone. I was trying to figure out how to help." "Help." She said the word like it tasted bitter. "Mister, I don't know you. I don't know why a man who looks like you would take an interest in my son. And I don't know what you want. So why don't you tell me straight before I call the police and let them figure it out?" Her voice was steady, but Victor could see the fear underneath it. The fear of a woman who'd been let down too many times, who'd learned that help usually came with strings attached. He respected that fear. It meant she was paying attention. "I don't want anything," he said. "I have a son, had a son. He died 15 years ago. He was about Lucas's age when I realized I hadn't been paying attention to the things that mattered." Victor kept his voice level, offering the words without expectation. "I saw your boy in that diner, and I saw something I recognized. A kid trying to survive something he shouldn't have to face alone. I'm not here to be his father or replace anyone. I'm just here because walking away didn't feel right." Sandra studied him for a long moment. Her eyes moved over his face, his vest, the tattoos on his hands. She was reading him the way you read a contract, looking for the trap. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked. "Visibility, support, People who'll show up and make it clear that Lucas has friends, friends who won't look the other way when someone tries to hurt him. He paused. I know some men, good men, despite how they look. They'd be willing to ride down here and spend some time, walk him to school, sit with him at the diner, let the town see that he's not alone. Bikers, Sandra said flatly. Yes. You want to surround my 8-year-old son with a motorcycle gang? Not a gang, a club. There's a difference. Victor held her gaze. And I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me earn that trust. If at any point you want us gone, we're gone. No questions, no arguments. Your son, your call. Sandra was quiet. Behind her, the coffee pot finished brewing and clicked off. Someone in. The kitchen called out an order in Spanish. The ordinary sounds of a restaurant continuing around a conversation that was anything but ordinary. Those boys, she said finally. Derek and his cousin. They've been after Lucas for 2 years. Since Carlos left, it got worse. I've tried everything. The school, the police, talking to the parents. Nothing works. Derek's father practically runs this town, and everyone's too scared to cross him. I'm not scared of car dealers. Something flickered in Sandra's eyes. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Let me think about it, she said. Give me your number. I'll call you tonight. Victor wrote his number on a napkin and slid it across the counter. Take whatever time you need. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. Mr. Rojas? He looked back. Thank you, she said. For standing up for him at the diner. No one else did. Someone should have. But they didn't. You did. She folded the napkin carefully and put it in her apron pocket. That counts for something. Victor nodded and walked out into the morning sun. He didn't know if Sandra would call. He didn't know if any of this would work. But for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was moving toward something instead of away from it. That had to count for something, too. Sandra called at 9:15 that night. Victor was in his motel room, sitting on the edge of the bed with a glass of water he hadn't touched, staring at the phone like he could will it to ring. When it finally did, he answered before the first ring finished. Mr. Rojas. Her voice was different than it had been at the restaurant, softer, more tired, the voice of a woman who'd spent the hours since their conversation wrestling with a decision. I talked to Lucas. What did he say? He said you were the man from the diner. The one who picked up his book. She paused. He said you looked at Derek like you weren't afraid of anything. Victor almost smiled. Kids see more than we think. They do. Sandra was quiet for a moment. He wants to meet you. Properly, I mean. Not just waving from the sidewalk. And you? I don't know what I want, Mr. Rojas. I don't know if this is the right thing or the worst mistake I've ever made. But I know that my son has been shrinking for 2 years, and yesterday he stood a little taller, because a stranger stood up for him. Her voice caught, just slightly. I can't give him that. I'm working all the time. And even when I'm home, I can't make the world stop hurting him. So if you can, if you and your friends can give him something I can't, then I have to let you try. We won't let you down. Don't make promises you can't keep. I don't. She gave him their address, though he already knew it. She told him to come by Saturday morning when she'd be home and Lucas wouldn't have school. She told him to park in the driveway this time, instead of across the street like a stalker. Yes, ma'am, Victor said, and he heard something that might have been a laugh on the other end of the line before she hung up. Saturday came with the kind of bright winter sun that made everything look sharper than it was. Victor arrived at the duplex at 10 o'clock alone. He'd considered bringing some of the others, a show of force, proof that he had backup, but decided against it. This first meeting needed to be small, personal. He needed Sandra and Lucas to see him as a person before they saw him as part of something larger. Sandra met him at the door. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, and she looked younger than she had at the restaurant, less armored. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. The duplex was small but clean, every surface organized with the precision of someone who couldn't afford clutter. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and the walls held photographs, Lucas as a baby, Lucas at a birthday party, Lucas with a man who had to be Carlos before he'd left. Victor noticed that the photos with Carlos had been moved to less prominent positions, not hidden, but not displayed either. The archaeology of a family learning to reshape itself around an absence. Lucas was sitting on the couch, his legs tucked beneath him, a book open in his lap. He looked up when Victor entered, and his eyes went immediately to the vest, tracing the patches with the focused attention of a boy who noticed everything. "Hi," Lucas said. "Hi." Victor stayed by the door, letting the boy set the pace. "That a good book?" Lucas looked down at the cover, then back up. "It's about a kid who finds a portal to another dimension. He has to save his sister from these creatures that live in the dark." "Sounds intense." "It's really good. The creatures aren't actually evil, though. They're just scared of the light because it hurts them. So the kid has to figure out how to help them instead of fighting them." Victor nodded slowly. "That's a smart way to solve a problem." "That's what I thought." Lucas closed the book and set it aside. He was studying Victor now with the same careful attention he'd given the patches. "My mom says you want to help me. If you want help, it's your choice." "Why?" The question was simple, direct, delivered without suspicion or accusation. Just curiosity. Victor thought about all the ways he could answer. The speech he'd given to Sandra, the explanations he'd rehearsed in his head. But looking at Lucas, he realized none of them were right. The boy deserved something simpler. "Because I was in a diner, and I saw you being treated badly and nobody else did anything," Victor said. "And that made me angry, not at you, at the situation, at the people who should have helped and didn't." He paused. "I had a son once. He died a long time ago. But before he died, I spent too much time on the road and not enough time paying attention. I can't fix that, but I can pay attention now." Lucas absorbed this quietly. "What was his name?" "Miguel." "That's a good name." It was. Victor felt the familiar ache in his chest, but it was different this time, softer, like a wound that had finally started to heal. "He would have liked you, I think. He loved books too." Lucas smiled, just a little. "My dad used to read to me, before he left." "Do you miss him?" "Sometimes. Mostly I'm just mad." Lucas looked down at his hands. "He didn't even say goodbye. He just left. And everyone acts like I'm not supposed to be mad about it, but I am." "You're allowed to be mad," Victor said. "Being mad doesn't mean you don't love someone. It just means they hurt you." Lucas looked up, something shifting in his expression. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that comes when someone finally says the thing you've been feeling but couldn't put into words. Sandra had been standing in the kitchen doorway, watching. Now she stepped forward, her arms crossed over her chest, but her posture less defensive than before. "Lucas, why don't you show Mr. Rojas your room? I'll make some coffee." Lucas stood up, tucking his book under his arm. "Okay, come on." The room was small, barely big enough for a twin bed and a desk, but Lucas had made it his own. Posters of superheroes on the walls, a shelf filled with paperbacks, their spines cracked from rereading, a model spaceship hanging from the ceiling, assembled with careful precision. It was the room of a boy who'd built a world inside his head because the world outside was too hard to control. "This is cool," Victor said, and he meant it. "Thanks." Lucas sat on the bed, his legs dangling. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Those guys, Derek and Ryan, they're not going to stop. My mom went to the school like 3 times. She talked to Derek's dad. Nothing works." He looked at Victor with eyes that were too old for his face. "What makes you think you can do anything?" It was a fair question, a smart question. Victor sat down on the desk chair, bringing himself closer to Lucas's level. "I can't promise they'll stop," he said honestly. "Some people are mean, and they stay mean no matter what you do. But I can promise you this, you won't have to face them alone. I have friends, a lot of friends, and they're willing to come here and stand with you. Not to fight, but to show people that you matter, that someone's paying attention. Like bodyguards? More like family. The kind of family you choose, not the kind you're born into." Victor leaned forward. "Here's what I'm thinking. Next week, some of my friends are going to ride into town. They're going to park at the diner, and we're going to have breakfast together. You, me, your mom, and about a dozen guys who look a lot scarier than Derek Shawcross has ever seen in his life." Lucas's eyes widened. "A dozen? Maybe more. Depends on who's available." Victor smiled. "And after that, whenever you need us, we'll be there. Walking you to school, sitting with you at lunch, if the school allows it. Whatever it takes to make sure everyone in this town knows that you're not alone." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Victor could see him processing, calculating, weighing the offer against everything he'd learned about how the world worked. "What if Derek's dad gets mad?" Lucas asked. "He's really powerful. My mom's scared of him." "I know. But here's the thing about power, Lucas. It only works if everyone agrees to be scared. And we're not scared." Victor held the boy's gaze. "Neither should you be. Not anymore." Something shifted in Lucas's face. The wariness didn't disappear. It was too deep for that. But underneath it, something else emerged, a spark, the first flicker of hope in eyes that had grown used to expecting nothing. "Okay," Lucas said, "let's do it." Victor extended his hand, and Lucas shook it. The boy's grip was stronger than he'd expected. "Deal," Victor said. They talked for another hour. Lucas showed him his books, his models, the comics he'd been drawing in a spiral notebook. Victor told him about motorcycles, about the road, about the places he'd seen and the people he'd met. By the time Sandra called them for coffee, something had shifted between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the foundation of it, the beginning of trust. At the door, Sandra handed Victor a cup to go. Her expression was still guarded, but the edges had softened. "Next Saturday?" she asked. "Next Saturday, 10 o'clock. I'll bring the others." She nodded, then quietly, "Thank you for talking to him. He doesn't have many people he can talk to. He's a good kid." "I know." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. "I just want him to know it too." Victor rode back to the motel with the sun on his face and the taste of cheap coffee on his lips. He thought about Lucas in that small room, building worlds out of books and models because the real world had let him down. He thought about Sandra, working herself to exhaustion, trying to hold everything together with hands that were already full. And he thought about next Saturday when the engines would roar into Harlingen and a boy would learn that he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. Lobo had promised 12 riders. By the time Victor got back to his room, his phone showed 18 confirmations, with more coming in every hour. Word had gotten out. The Hijos were riding. They came on a Saturday morning in late January when the Texas sun was bright, but the air still held the bite of winter. Victor heard them before he saw them, a low rumble building in the distance, growing louder, shaking the windows of the duplex on Elm Street, where he'd arrived an hour early to help Sandra's and Lucas prepare. Lucas was at the window, his nose pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the pain. He'd been there since sunrise, unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything except the road that led into town. Sandra stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her expression caught somewhere between hope and terror. "Here they come," Lucas whispered. The first bikes crested the hill at the edge of town, a line of chrome and leather that seemed to stretch back to the horizon. Victor had expected maybe 20 riders. He counted 30 before he stopped counting. They rolled down Main Street in perfect formation, 2 by 2, their engines harmonizing into a single thunderous voice that announced their presence to everyone within a mile. People came out of their houses. They stood on porches and sidewalks, watching the procession with a mixture of awe and confusion. The Bluebonnet Diner emptied as customers pressed against the windows. At the car dealership on the highway, a man in a suit stepped outside, his phone already in his hand. Derek's father, Victor guessed, trying to figure out what was happening in his town. The column turned onto Elm Street and slowed. One by one, the bikes pulled to the curb, filling the block with machines and men. Engines died in sequence, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than the noise had been. 37 riders, Victor counted now, 37 members of Hijos del Camino, plus a handful from allied clubs who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. Lobo dismounted first. He walked up the cracked sidewalk to the duplex, his boots heavy on the concrete, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at Lucas, who was staring down at him with eyes like saucers. "You must be Lucas," Lobo said. His voice was gruff but warm. "I'm Aurelio. Everyone calls me Lobo." "Like the wolf," Lucas said. Lobo smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Exactly like the wolf. You know your Spanish." "My mom taught me." Lucas glanced back at Sandra, who nodded encouragingly. He turned back to Lobo. "Are all these people here for me?" "Every single one." Lobo gestured to the riders assembled behind him. Big men in leather vests, some with beards, some with shaved heads, all of them watching the boy on the porch with expressions of quiet respect. "We heard you've been having some trouble. We came to make sure that trouble knows you're not alone." Lucas was silent for a moment. His lower lip trembled, and he bit down on it hard. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Lobo climbed the steps and crouched down to Lucas's level. "But I want you to remember something, okay? There are people in this world who hurt others because it makes them feel powerful. And there are people who stand up to them because it's the right thing to do. You're one of the second kind, Lucas. I can see it in you. We all can." Lucas looked at Victor, who nodded. "It's true," Victor said. "That's why we're here." The morning unfolded like a dream Lucas would remember for the rest of his life. The riders spread out through the neighborhood, introducing themselves to neighbors who came out to see what was happening. They shook hands, traded names, answered questions with patience and humor. A few of them had brought gifts: a leather jacket sized for a boy, a helmet painted with flames, a model motorcycle kit that Lucas could build himself. At 11 o'clock, the whole group walked to the Bluebonnet Diner, 37 bikers, one boy, and his mother, processing down Main Street like a parade. People stopped to stare. Cars pulled over. Someone started clapping, and others joined in, until the sound followed them all the way to the diner's door. Darlene nearly dropped her coffee pot when they walked in. "Lord have mercy," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Victor, is that you?" "It's me." He gestured to Lucas, who was walking beside him, wearing his new leather jacket over his t-shirt. "We're here for breakfast, all of us." The diner couldn't hold everyone, so they improvised. Tables were pushed together inside, and more were set up in the parking lot, where riders sat on their bikes and balanced plates on their knees. Darlene recruited 2 of her neighbors to help with the orders, and the kitchen worked at full capacity, sending out eggs and bacon and pancakes in an endless stream. Lucas sat at the center table, surrounded by men who looked like they belonged in a movie about outlaws. They asked him about school, about his books, about the model spaceship in his room. They listened when he talked and laughed at his jokes and treated him like he was the most important person in the building, because for today, he was. Derek Shawcross appeared at noon. Victor saw him first, the tall, angular frame, the face that hadn't grown into its bones. Derek was standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching the scene with an expression Victor couldn't quite read. His cousin Ryan was beside him, and behind them, at a safe distance, a man in a suit who had to be Derek's father. The diner grew quiet as people noticed. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone was watching. Victor stood up from his table. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The movement was enough to draw attention, and the attention was enough to make Derek freeze. Lobo rose as well, then another rider, and another, until a dozen men were standing, their presence a silent wall between the bullies and the boy they'd come to protect. Derek's face went pale. He looked at his father, who was speaking urgently into his phone, then back at the diner, at the men who were watching him, with expressions that promised nothing, but held everything. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Derek turned and walked away. His cousin followed. His father lingered a moment longer, his face red with a fury he couldn't express, before retreating to his car and driving off. The diner erupted in cheers. Lucas was grinning, a real grin, the kind that transformed his whole face. Sandra had tears streaming down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. Darlene was laughing and crying at the same time, refilling coffee cups with shaking hands. Victor sat back down and picked up his fork. Across the table, Lobo caught his eye and nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of everything they'd accomplished. The riders stayed until mid-afternoon. They posed for photos with Lucas, signed his jacket with Sharpies, gave him their phone numbers, and told him to call if he ever needed anything. They talked to Sandra about resources, legal aid, counseling services, a women's group in McAllen that helped single mothers navigate difficult situations. They left behind more than memories. They left behind a network, a safety web woven from leather and chrome, and the stubborn belief that no child should have to face cruelty alone. By 4 o'clock, the bikes were gone, their thunder fading into the distance, leaving Elm Street quiet again. Lucas stood on the porch, still wearing his jacket, watching the last rider disappear around the corner. Victor was the only one who'd stayed behind. "You okay?" he asked. Lucas nodded slowly. "That was the best day of my life. There'll be more. Not every day will be like this, but we'll be back. And any time you need us, we'll come. Promise?" "Promise." Lucas looked down at his jacket, at the signatures scrawled across the leather in silver and black and blue. "Victor?" "Yeah? Thank you for standing up that day in the diner, for not walking away." Victor felt the familiar ache in his chest, the place where Miguel had lived, where grief had hollowed him out for 15 years. But it was different now. Not healed exactly, but changed, filled with something new. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me." He rode out of Harlingen that evening, heading west into a sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The road stretched ahead of him, endless and open, the way it always had. But something was different now. He wasn't running from anything. He was carrying something with him. The memory of a boy who'd waved from a sidewalk, a mother who'd trusted a stranger, a town that had learned what it looked like when people showed up. The club would return to Harlingen. They'd ride in once a month, regular as clockwork, to check on Lucas and Sandra. They'd escort him to school on the first day of each year. They'd sit in the bleachers at his Little League games and cheer louder than anyone else. They'd become part of his life, the family he'd chosen, the one that chose him back. Derek Shawcross never bothered Lucas again. His father tried to file complaints, tried to use his influence to make trouble, but the attention had shifted. The story had spread. A local news station picked it up, then a regional one, then a website that covered stories of kindness that went viral. The car dealership's reputation suffered. People started driving to the next town for their vehicles. Power, it turned out, only worked when everyone agreed to be afraid. Victor kept writing. He visited Lucas when he could, called. When he couldn't, sent postcards from the places the road took him. He never tried to be the boy's father. That wasn't his role, and he knew it. But he became something else. A mentor, a protector, a reminder that the world, for all its cruelty, still held people who gave a damn. Years later, when Lucas was 16 and learning to ride his own motorcycle, a gift from the club for his birthday, he asked Victor why he'd stopped at the diner that day, why he'd stood up, why he'd stayed. Victor thought about it for a long moment. He thought about Miguel, about grief, about all the miles he'd traveled trying to outrun a pain that lived inside him. Because someone should have, he said finally, and I was there. Lucas nodded, understanding in a way that went beyond words. They rode together into the evening, two figures on the open road, the sound of their engines carrying across the Texas flatland, like a promise that distance couldn't break. Some debts couldn't be repaid, some gifts couldn't be returned. But kindness, once given, had a way of multiplying, spreading outward in ripples that reached places you'd never see, touching lives you'd never know. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole point.